Hello, I'm David Brown. I'm the chair of the INS College of Fellows. And we have a program to try to interview some of our most famous members, the pioneers in the field of artificial intelligence. Our interviewee today is Gail Carpenter, Professor Emerita of Mathematics and Statistics, Boston University. Gail Carpenter's neural modeling work began with her Ph.D. thesis, Traveling Wave Solutions of Nerve Impulse Equations at the University of Wisconsin, Department of Mathematics. Subsequently, she taught at MIT, Northeastern University, and Boston University. Starting in the 1980s, she developed the adaptive resonance theory, ART, family of neural networks for fast, stable online learning, pattern recognition, and prediction. These ART models, designed by integrating cognitive and neural principles with system-level computational constraints, have been used in a wide range of applications, including industrial design, remote sensing, medical diagnosis, mobile robots, rule discovery, and database management. Other aspects of her research include the development, computational analysis, and application of neural models of vision, synaptic transmission, and circadian rhythms. Her work in vision has ranged from models of photoreceptors to color processing and long-range figure completion. She has organized numerous conferences and symposia for INS, IEEE, and the American Mathematical Society, and served on the INS board and the AMS Council. At Boston University, she served as a founding member of the Center for Adaptive Systems and the Department of Cognitive and Neural Systems, and as founder and director of the CNS Technology Lab. She received the IEEE Neural Networks Pioneer Award and the INS Gabor Award, and is a fellow of INS and IEEE. Well, Gail, it's good to see you today. And I'd first like to ask you, how on earth did you get into the field?
I will tell you momentarily, but I'd first like to thank you, David, and INS for organizing this project, documenting some of the history of our field, and those of us who've been fortunate enough to participate in it for a number of years. So thank you very much for doing this. So over to my personal history. At the University of Wisconsin, I was sitting next to a fellow student named Pete Munson, who's now at NIH. And he told me he was taking an engineering class, and he described a differential equation he had been taught that was a model of the nerve cell, the Hodgkin-Huxley equation. And I found this idea electrifying. I can still see us sitting there in class, waiting for that in my mind's eye. I later analyzed the Hodgkin-Huxley system for my PhD thesis with advisor Charles Conley, who was a distinguished scholar of geometric methods for dynamical systems. Then in 1974, I joined the MIT Department of Mathematics. MIT, which had been home to neural network and AI pioneers, McCulloch and Pitts, Wiener, and McCarthy, was still home to Minsky and Papert, whose critique of Rosenblatt's perceptron cast a long shadow and ushered in the so-called winter of our field. So this was in the early 70s. Nonetheless, in a different department from Minsky and Papert, the math department, I was able to participate, and I was very lucky to be able to do this, in a lively seminar group on biological modeling, one of whose members was Stephen Grossberg. And I will talk about, he'll come into some of this professional story, but just on a side, I want to say, in a most fortunate and parallel development, Steve and I met in the MIT math department, married, and all these years later are happy grandparents. So it shows
that's very good, Gail.
Never know. Building two. Okay. And that was how I started in the field.
Now, even today, there are very few women in our field. Didn't you feel very lonely back in those days?
Yes, and it is very strange, and I don't understand it. I've had a special interest in encouraging and helping young women, students, and other colleagues, and there have been a few. But back when I was in graduate school, it was huge news when a woman, Barbara Walters, was allowed to read the news in the nightly news. People thought the world would collapse. There were almost no female clergy, very few female doctors, scientists of all kinds. And in most of those fields, it has changed dramatically, but not in our field. And I really don't know why. I would have loved to have had more women colleagues. I have a lot of women friends in other areas, and I've collaborated, very importantly, over many years with female collaborators in interdisciplinary. So one of my closest collaborators is Suchi Gopal, who was and still is in the BU Department of Earth Sciences. And we did a lot of projects on remote sensing. So I managed to sort of broaden my horizons and have a lot of female friendships and some colleagues and collaborators, but I don't know. I don't know why this is. Even in neuroscience, the women have become president and leadership and very visible. But in our field, which is right adjacent to neuroscience, no, I don't know why. I have no idea. I can't answer.
A final question along these lines. How is it that you got into anything mathematical or into this field, just from high school or
Yes,
how?
I will tell you. I think the biggest impediment is little girls grow up thinking girls don't do math, even to this day. I'll tell you, my mother was a math major, and actually my daughter was a math major.
Huh.
And I was giving a little talk at a career seminar when she was in college that was organized by the women in math, for the girls in the math department. And at one point I asked, so there must have been 2 or 3 dozen young and older women in the room. Before I started talking, I said, how many of you have mothers who were math majors? And half the room raised their hands.
That's remarkable.
And this was 20 years ago. So it was not right just now. And so I think that's part of it. In my family also, I have 4 younger brothers. I kind of grew up surrounded by, where are all the girls? Well, it was okay. That's just the way the world is. I don't know. But I think in my family, it was in my schools. I wasn't only in college before I got some things where I thought, whoa, why are they asking me that? Why do you really understand this kind of question from one of the teachers? And I thought, what are you talking about? And I realized that I never had pushed down Now, not that everyone, all my friends went into math, far from it, but I never felt like it was something I couldn't and shouldn't do.
Okay, that's really interesting. Let's move on to what are your most significant accomplishments in the field?
Okay, so in thinking about this, as I indicated, going way back, I've been working in this field for 5 decades, which they pile up. So I organized my answer by decades and have 1 or 2 projects from each decade. And this leaves out some whole areas that I worked in, but these are things I'm especially proud of that I like to talk about. So the first, you mentioned my PhD thesis, and I actually have a little bit of show and tell, if it shows up on the screen.
It does.
This is my first archival journal article titled "A Geometric Approach to Singular Perturbation Problems with Applications to Nerve Impulse Equations." And it says I was at the Northeastern math department, which by the time it actually appeared, I'd been at MIT and I'd moved on to Northeastern already. So this is essentially my PhD thesis, where I generalized the Hodgkin-Huxley system and used mathematical methods. I can show you. I was looking at a manuscript of it, but a typical, I want to show you. This is before we had word processing or computer graphics. So a typical page looks something like this, and you can see the hand-drawn pictures. So there were lots of equations, which I typed my thesis here on the other side. Here's other hand-drawn pictures. But I typed my thesis with all those equations. This is typeset now on an IBM Selectric. So anytime anyone is, if you ever have a student who complains about Microsoft Word, you can say, back in my day, try swapping in those little symbols.
That's right, that was my day too.
But even then, I was glad to have the IBM Selectric. It was an electric typewriter that you could actually do it, but it was really hard to type. So anyway, I started out in a series then of projects in that decade. I got very interested in patterns of nerve signals. By that, I mean, I'm still just talking about single nerve cells, and the classic Hodgkin-Huxley model produces single, almost point-like spikes that then can propagate long distances. And when I started, Hodgkin and Huxley had just then recently won the Nobel Prize. As far as I know, it's the only Nobel Prize awarded to a neural model to this day. But it was very exciting, and it was a lot of people were very interested in. There were meetings and lots of seminars and discussions about that. And I got very interested in patterns of signals, again, still just propagated down. And one of the papers toward the end of this time is here. And its title is "Normal and Abnormal Signal Patterns in Nerve Cells." So again, a lot of people were interested in this topic, but what interested me is based on what I had seen in this geometric analysis, not just plugging in some parameters and you get a simulation, which is important, but in the geometry, you could look at different types of solutions. I was seeing a lot of patterns of spikes coming out just from the basic Hodgkin-Huxley equation. So a lot of people who were interested in different spike patterns would add a few terms to Hodgkin-Huxley, calcium, other things, and say, okay, then you can get this. And I had a couple of illustrations I was going to pull up because I was interested in these things that are in the data. This is one copy of some data from a snail. And if you look at just these top two, if you can see that.
Yes.
The top is a regular bum, bum, bum spike pattern. So that's just a classical evenly spaced spike. Under it is an approximately the same frequency on average, but it goes bum, 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 bum. Now, how did they get that? This is in a snail cell. They got it, the second one, by spraying a little bit of cocaine on the cell.
You're telling me that you're addicting snails to hard drugs.
I think the snail had already met its maker at that point. I suspect. This was not a living organism. They were just looking at the single cells. And the point is, in what sense is that excitable? Well, if you have it reach a synapse and it releases some transmitter, that gets reuptaked and might not even have any cause. But if you have a boom, 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 it can be incremental and then allow the target cell to reach threshold and produce a signal spike that continues on down. So bursts of patterns, bursts of spikes produce more excitability than evenly spaced spikes that have the same average frequency. And in the models that I was studying, there were a lot of patterns like this and this, and it produced the basic Hodgkin-Huxley model in different parametric ranges were producing patterns kind of like that. And I just, and here was another data that I gave them names, and so up here at the top is something called, this was in a different organism, this was in Aplysia, and the top spike pattern, these are data, these aren't from my simulations, but is called parabolic. It starts out less and then it gets faster and faster and less, and then it rests, and then, so they go, so it's called parabolic, and down there, paroxysmal, the second one. So there were these different patterns that were being propagated along the cells that were being studied at that time in the literature. And then I was seeing those in the model. So that went on for a few years and it was fun and interesting, but I started getting interested in, these were still single cells. So then I started moving to slightly bigger networks and bigger networks that could have more, not more interesting, but different, qualitatively different dynamics. So that takes me through, that was basically my my primary topic through the 1970s.
And so you were really fundamentally concerned with the neurobiology.
I always have been, even when I do a lot of applications, and that's going to come up answering even some of your other questions. You'll see, I think there are a lot of ways people can bring their interest to the field. And that was one of mine, even though it doesn't always show up. And the mathematics doesn't always show up. Some of my mathematical colleagues will look at the actual analysis and say, well, that's easy. Where are you bringing algebraic geometry in or something? But I've always viewed the mathematics as the infrastructure of my thinking, to think about a model and be able to put them together and imagine dynamics. That goes right back to my mathematical training, even though it doesn't look quite like my pure math colleagues does. Should I go on to the next decade then?
Sure.
Okay, so the theme of the next decade is the art model, the first art model. So as you and many of the people watching this know, Steve Grossberg introduced adaptive resonance in the 70s. In fact, he was developing it when we first met. But we weren't collaborating on it, but I heard a lot about it. But it was called adaptive resonance theory. It was a theory of cognitive information processing. And he had papers called things like, how does a brain build a cognitive code? So there were qualitative models there in his work for that first decade almost, up until when I started working. But I got interested in actually implementing the theory as an actual model. And Steve had defined some model elements he thought would work, say, about how it could match. One of the fundamental art computations is they essentially all have a match between a top-down and a bottom-up signal, as many neural systems do. And he had a rule, but I couldn't get that to work. And I ended up defining some new elements that led to the Art1 model. So there was a very different matching rule. His early work hadn't had anything like vigilance, which is part of the matching rule. So in order to get started with the most stripped down model that I could think of, it was taking binary input patterns, but arbitrarily large, and also what we in the field called winner take all, or ultimately compressed coding. So after competition, only one, sometimes called grandmother cell, only one cell remains active in the model that you can think of as the one that then might map to the letter A versus the letter Z. So that's the code. And it was winner take all. And this happened to be going on, the development that when I was involved in it in the mid 80s, at a time that I think of as the ignition point of our field. Were you at the 1987
Yes.
IEEE meeting?
Yes.
Which suddenly, instead of having our entire field sit around one dining room table, if we were all there, all of a sudden there were literally thousands of people at this IEEE meeting in San Diego in 1987. And my belief is the large majority were actually engineers. And I have always gotten along very, very well. I'm not an engineer, but engineers really get it about models, which at that time, a lot of lab scientists, now it's changed a lot, but lab science was much more what is now sort of scorn called reductionist. You know, you look, you measure it, but most lab scientists were not trained in modeling or math or quantitative methods. And again, it's gotten much. This has changed a lot over this whole field's called systems neuroscience. And anyway, that's where we were back then. And so it was gratifying that some of these engineers, even as the early version, so the paper that is the archival paper, I don't think I put this up yet, that defines Art1 from 1987. It's called the same year as that big meeting, a massively parallel architecture for a self-organizing neural pattern recognition machine. although we had had a number of announcements of it earlier, and patents, which were filed in 1985. BU patent these, and they got bought up by one of these sort of patent mill companies about 15 years ago, which was nice. But you know, we never used them to try to restrict anything, but BU wanted us to, and it was, anyway, that happened all through the mid 80s. And this was very exciting. And it was especially exciting that some engineers, especially, were excited about taking neural models, including even this rudimentary now ART1 model, and using it in their industrial and other settings. Notably, Tom Caudell, who went to Boeing right around that time. And I consulted a little bit with Boeing, and they used ART1 almost like a transistor. They had to do a great deal of work to build. They had a whole design, a CAD system whose fundamental computational unit was ART1, and a hierarchy, lots of little ART1s that went together. And also then it was built into the Boeing manufacturing system, and they had some estimate that it saved tens of millions of dollars. I don't know. This is all going back almost, what, 40 years now. So it's gone on from there. But it was very gratifying and surprising, really, because we had not had any experience with this kind of technology transfer. We were the mathematicians, sort of, even in the math community, we were kind of off in the sidebar of conferences. So anyway, that went on in that time. But ART1, in addition to being binary and winner take all, was also just unsupervised. It was I think you can hardly get a more stripped down version. But I wanted something that would actually work in real time, and it did. And so right away, I got working on a supervised version, especially with my student, John Reynolds, who has for many years now been at the Salk Institute. He went into neuroscience. Our students went in every direction, from the most applied to the most neuroscience. And we called that supervised system ART map. I won't read the whole thing. And it was very exciting. We got it to work. And this was part of John's PhD thesis. And in order to make ART map work, we also, and this is a theme that went through a lot of these, going for the first ART1, and then some new model elements had to be invented for this. And so there's a component of the supervised system called match tracking, which, how do you get a reset? If you predict something, it's wrong, why doesn't the system just sit there? Well, there's a reset signal. Well, where did that come from? Well, this notion of a vigilance matching, the system feeds back to the matching center and raises the vigilance parameter, which is the matching criterion, just enough to trigger a reset. And by the reason for just enough is you could have a learning system which might be great just by memorizing every single thing. It's called nearest neighbor, right? You memorize all your exemplars, and sometimes that's a perfectly good system, but it has no compression. If you've got 1 million exemplars, it's a lot of exemplars to carry around. So by raising it just enough to trigger a reset, you get the maximally compressed code that makes the correct predict. That is correct on your training set. And so match tracking was a new element. And at the same time, in order to move past the binary input constraint, which of course is a big constraint, just black and white inputs, we defined something called fuzzy art, which just in many settings is fuzzy. Zada's fuzzy set theory had also sat kind of fallow for a long time. Nobody really taking it up until around this time also in the whole field of fuzzy computation and applications. And it's really a generalization, just how you can represent analog. But it's much more, in my opinion, it's much more straightforward, especially for comparing to neural implantations than say the Euclidean computation, which involves lots of squares and square roots and dividing. And it's a straightforward generalization of intersections and unions and works great. So we had something called fuzzy art that generalized the binary inputs, but in order also to make that work well, we introduced another new element that also has persisted. Most of these elements have persisted through most of these decades with all the different art type things. It was called complement coding, which takes each input, presents not only the input, but 1 minus the input if they're scaled. And so your input is twice as big. It's the input and its complement. But what this allows your system to do is to learn absent features that can be just as predictive as features that are actually there. And if you have features that only the ones that are actually there, then how do you know if, say, a purple dog, why do you know a purple dog is surprising, a real dog, not a toy dog? Well, because you've seen a lot of dogs. And if I said, what color is a dog? You'd say, well, what do you mean? They could be white or brown or black, all these colors. But the ones that you never saw don't really get encoded very well. Anyway, so there were a lot of model inputs and applications, and as I said, a whole bunch of people taking up the notion of implementing these in applications, and we worked with some of them. We had examples, and I was looking just today at the list of my students. The large majority of my PhD students didn't go into academia. They went into anything from MIT Lincoln Lab. I mentioned John Reynolds, who went to the SOC. He was much more the academic than most of my students. A lot of them are now in biotech or other kind of application areas. Anyway, that's what they were doing. Okay. So that's the 80s. And during the 80s, I became a mom too. So this was all going on. I was really busy, but it was a good time. Lots of fun things. So in the 90s, thinking about the description of the art models, winner take all. Everybody knew that the nervous system, if you care about that, has coding which can be highly compressed, even almost like a winner take all or grandmother cell, but a lot of coding in the cortex is highly distributed. And this was a key feature of the perceptron, which by then had been generalized to backpropagation and other models that were very successful and popular and being used all over the place. They featured highly distributed coding. And so I always wanted to generalize the winner take all art. But if you there were some intrinsic computational problems that you could just say, if you just take the same old model, distribute the coding, it basically collapses back to winner take all. All the active nodes learn the same stuff and they collapse back, equivalent to winner take all. And I thought about it and thought about it. And at that time, as is still the case, this was the key breakthrough actually in going to that, was noticing that all the models and all the neuroscientists who, if you could translate into a model, use multiplicative weights, the classic signal times the weight. And it was so ubiquitous that it seemed like a fact that was not to be questioned. But for years, literally, I had been sort of knocking at the distributed coding, knocking, and couldn't get anywhere. And I finally said to myself one day, okay, throw out everything I know, stop trying to make it neural, stop trying to do anything. I'm going to, in effect, reverse engineer. I'm just going to work backwards and say, what is it that I really need? And then see how close I can get that to what I think corresponds to neural principles. And what I was able to write down on the paper, once I got rid of that prior of the multiplicative weight as the unit of long-term memory, I realized that what I really needed was what I called an adaptive threshold. In effect, a long-term unit of long-term memory that's additive or actually it subtracts off an adaptive threshold. So when the threshold rises, that's sort of like the weight going down. It goes in the opposite direction. And with winner take all coding, they all are the same in the art model, but with distributed coding, basically the basic idea is that, so there were certain art design goals that we always tried to implement as an aspiration. And one of them is that the systems could learn with fast as well as slow learning. So fast learning is when the weights are allowed to go all the way to their asymptote on every single learning trial. And a great many neural systems that are useful, like backpropagation, if you do that, the system basically just learns the last thing it saw and forgets way too much. And so keeping with fast learning that would be stable, not just keep forgetting everything it's already learned. Even if you have a large scale application with many inputs, no matter how slow you're learning, it's subject to, and it was well known in the field that the phrase is catastrophic forgetting, that something could be going along, seems to work fine, and all of a sudden the whole learning of the system just seems to fall apart. And you could come up easily with an example. Well, what if it just happens by bad luck to see the same thing 1,000 times in a row? So no matter how slow the learning, you present the same input over and over, or a similar one, it's going to have the same problem that fast learning would have presented to that system. So holding on to fast learning, the thing is, with an adaptive threshold, if the activation is below that, it's not going to have any weight change at all. So the idea, the goal, the design goal, and we're going to get there a little bit later in the decade, is to be able to support fast, stable learning with an arbitrarily distributed code instead of just the severe restriction of winner take all. Now, I got interested. How the heck did we get stuck with this multiplicative weight? Where did it come from? It's not fact. You can write down other models. Where did it come from? And I started to backtrack to the point where it was not axiomatic. And the point where it became axiomatic, I believe, was in the very early 60s with the electrical, like Woodrow Hoff, the electrical implementation where the multiplicative weight was a natural realization, electrical realization of an adaptive weight. But before that came the great Frank Rosenblatt, who defined the perceptron, which got trumped on by Minsky and Papert. But if you look at his papers in his book from the 50s, he had a series of axioms that define the perceptron. And within his definition of what you could call a long-term memory trace, that would encompass both the multiplicative and the adaptive threshold. They would both be compatible with Rosenblatt's original axiomatization of a vast array of neural models. And so that was exciting to me. Okay, it's not a fact. It was also an accepted piece of neuroscience. And that bothered me too, because the basic unit of long-term memory at the synapse in neuroscience was what was called LTP, or long-term potentiation. If you translate that to a model, it was, again, a multiplicative weight. And that you do something to it, you test with a single pulse, and you say if the response is stronger, then it was potentiated or the weight increased. I'm going to come back to that because for quite a number of years, I was very disturbed by this. I thought, okay, it works computationally. It's just what I need. But it doesn't seem to be what the neuroscientists are telling me. And spoiler alert, we're going to get back to that. Although I can't say it's universally accepted, but when I get to just almost. But what I want to say before I get there is just to show you the papers. It took years. This was maybe the hardest thing I ever had to do, was make this, let go of these notions and figure this out. And I did it over quite a long, well, I was doing a lot of other stuff, but this was sort of my back to what I really wanted to do when I had time to think about it. So my first paper on it was called a distributed outstar. And the outstar learning, it's a word that Steve used early on, and outstar is basically a coding node, and it looks down at a pattern. So it looks at a spatial pattern. And if it's winner take all coding, you can use the outstar because it just comes from one, and then it looks down with all its things that says, oh, what am I seeing? And it learns that. So the distributed outstar went from the coding field distributed down to learn a pattern, and it was doing that. But in art models, this corresponds to the top-down portion. So art models typically have a bottom-up where you choose the code, and then a top-down piece where the code looks back down and says, oh, okay, now I've matched I'm going to learn this matched pattern. So it was the top-down learning piece. And I couldn't get any farther than that, but it had the elements. This is where I introduced things like the adaptive threshold, and then a new learning law that used it for it. But I still was, okay, that's okay, but it's not enough for a distributed art system. But with a couple more years of work, I was able to get, I still needed the bottom-up direction, which had, so this is my journal article about the distributed art model, which then had a distributed analog going from the input up to the coding field called the distributed instar. It also uses the same adaptive threshold formalism and put all together, and then put with search, and there are a lot of pieces, but it worked, and I was glad of that. Now, and then I also, of course, as we all do, worked with my students. Here were two of my, I've had wonderful students. This one, talking about women, I had a wonderful student named Boriana Milanova, and then another student named Ben Nowski, who did less, but he made good contributions too. But Boriana was a great student, and she went to work at Oracle, you know, like so many of them, as I said, they didn't go into academia. And we looked at some supervised learning examples and compared lots of computational examples with the distributed thing. And so then I was sure that, okay, it's really working. And we did a lot of stuff and made sure that it was all working with lots of computational examples. So it wasn't just me writing a paper about how in theory, this is all gonna work great. But distributed art, it does reduce to art and art map when the coding happens to be winner take all. Computationally, they reduce. But there's a little bit more elements there. And whenever, with all, especially with my students, we throw in the kitchen sink, we throw anything in, I always say, we got to justify it. I'm always having them compare say a supervised learning system, compare it with winner take all or K nearest neighbor. We always would do stuff like that because I said, simple, it works. Who needs us? We'll do something else. And year after year, on examples, we would occasionally throw in distributed art map and trying to see, well, what of our, over the years, we got something that I called default art map, which was sort of, if you don't know anything about the problem, just use this. And it had winner take all coding, and it was basic, and we had software out there that people could get. I could never find an example which really warranted using distributed art map on that example. Year after year, lots and lots of examples. I couldn't recommend it. It didn't do worse, and sometimes it did a little better, sometimes a little worse, but it didn't have any consistent value where I could say, okay, this is worth it. There were other model elements that we sort of added on to the basics over the years, but not this. I wanted it. I really wanted it, but it didn't happen. So moving, but I'm going to come back to that, but it's not going to happen for another decade. So in the meantime, in the next decade, which is in the 2000s, one of the things I did was continue the theme of linking the brain science to the model. So for example, okay, one thing I didn't mention about distributed art, which was a hard thing to let go of. If you can see this picture, the top picture up there, that's a classical art model, art architecture with the bottom up and the top down. And there are even pictures that look a lot like that, even in Steve's earlier theoretical work. And all of the earlier winner take all, like Art One, Fuzzy Art, they all had that sort of architecture. I could never get that architecture to work in principle with anything other than winner take all coding. And so as an architecture, it wasn't just a matter of new learning laws or anything else. And I could tell you why. There were actually principled reasons why I didn't think it would work, but that's another story. So one of the really hard things to do, again, letting go of received notion, is actually to change the architecture itself, the configuration of those fields, going from winner take all, the earlier art, to distributed art. And down here is a sketch on this side here of right here, this side right here, of the distributed art model. And you can see it says distributed out star, top down, and distributed in star. But the fundamentally new architecture is that matching field over here is off on the side. It's not in between the input and the coding field. See, the input goes right to the coding field and the matching is over there. Well, one thing I found exciting, and this is actually a paper in a Trends in Cognitive Sciences that I was invited to write. And so it was not in a modeling journal, it was in a science journal. And one thing I was very excited about was that the distributed art architecture had very, in my mind, very compelling mapping of these fields over to certain fields in the cortex. The cortex replicates this sort of laminar structure going up, up, up. And some of those layers in the laminar structure, V4, V6, correspond functionally, I think, to corresponding elements of the distributed art model. And then the fact that the model carries with it learning laws and other things, those correspond to predictions. If you have an adapt, and also function, it's saying, well, what is the layer 6 doing? Well, if it corresponds to one of these, this is the prediction, this is what it's doing. And where is matching? Matching is in a different, anyway. So the mapping over to the neuroscience was something that was exciting and interesting to me. And so we're in the first decade of this millennium, and getting back to the question of where is anything other than the multiplicative weight in the neuroscience data. And what was frustrating about it was that the data wouldn't tease it apart. And I asked, and I'd be giving a lecture at a bigger group and ask the question, here's this, it works. Are there any data that you know about? In the group, I'd ask individuals, neuroscientists, and there was one point I asked a speaker in our colloquium series, do you know any data that speak to, when I translated it to something he had just talked about? And he said, yes, that he had just heard about some still unpublished data coming from the laboratory of Henry Markram. And it produced a paper called, by Markram and Sadix, where they were talking about something called, here, this is a paper, another one with my student Boriana that I mentioned before, redistribution of synaptic efficacy supports, that's now me, stable pattern learning in neural networks. And what Markram and Sadix, I think Sadix was his postdoc at that time, discovered that was, they said to themselves, wait a minute, all of these long-term potentiations are always measured with one spike. What if we measure them with more than one spike? And that was the question I was asking. What if we measure potentiation? And the linear model, the multiplicative one, says, well, if you've got two spikes, you get twice as, it's a linear thing. Not at all. It looked totally different. That's why they call it redistribution of synaptic efficacy. And that was their term, RSE. And it had, but it was exactly what the adaptive threshold model of LTP, of long-term memory, was predicting. And that's what we showed, and we discussed their data and why and all that stuff in a little paper here, but it was very exciting. This was the first I heard of any data. Now, after this, I went to the Neuroscience conference and went all over the big giant poster hall I had one question I wanted to ask students and people doing posters on LTP. I thought this paper, which not this one, but Markram and Sadek's, it appeared in Nature. It wasn't off in some corner, it was in Nature. I thought this would set the world of LTP on fire. I was so excited. I wanted to know what they thought. I couldn't find anyone who'd even heard about it. But, you know, and this was in their thing. This is a very famous neuroscientist who published it in Nature. It just went, and I asked Henry Markram a year or two later, what did you think? I thought this was so revolutionary. And he just said, business as usual. It just vanished off the landscape. Their paper was published in 1996. Now, maybe this other notion of LTP, it basically demolishes the linear notion of LTP. Because the classic model of LTP is you measure it with you do something, you measure single spike before, single spike later. And if you measure that, you're not going to see this. Anyway, that was exciting. And it took a long time. And I really, really worried about it. And of course, some people said, oh, you know, there's no data supporting it. And I'd have to say, yeah, that's true, but it works computationally. What can I say? You know, it's what I needed. I don't know why I call it a prediction or something, but it's just, I'm not saying nobody could do it with the multiplicative, but I've never seen it. I've asked people for that. Nobody that I know about has ever been able to do that. So that was one exciting thing. And I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but I had a whole other, what I found exciting project direction, which, well, there's a paper for it, but I'll tell you what it is. It's the idea of transforming information into knowledge. Now that's so highfalutin. It was a very modest version of it, but I'll give you an example. And it started with the observation that one of the capabilities of art models is you can have one input that maps to more than one output. So for example, let's say you see a dog in your neighborhood and you're little and you're learning words, and a trusted person like your mother says, oh, doggy. So, it's a dog. And the next day she says, Rover, this very same dog. Now, do you say, and you're there thinking, oh, doggy, and she's saying, well, is it a different name? No, over time, we not only learn that things can have more than one name, but in this model, and I think in there's a lot of data that suggests uses an art system, it can learn things like Rover's a dog, but not necessarily the other. So is Spot. Okay, so that's a modest version of knowledge. And then in the last decade, I'll go faster. This is to me one of the most exciting projects, even though it was later in my career, called self-supervised art map, self-supervised. And the idea, and this continues, I'll morph this into my continuing interests. What this model does is learn from experience. And you could say, well, okay, why not just have unsupervised learning? Well, unsupervised learning, I've tried it, lots of people have tried it. My reading of the literature and how people feel about it is you throw in a lot of unsupervised stuff. Sometimes it makes things get worse, sometimes better. There's no big theory, when does it, how should you do unsupervised learning? Self-supervised takes a different paradigm of it, but it's basically taking oceans of unsupervised learning, and the key to make it work was to use distributed art map in it. So remember I said back 15 years earlier, I was so disappointed I could never find a place for this model, which was one of my, special computational babies. And finally, and this is very exciting to me, and in simulations with another one of my really wonderful students, his name is Greg Amos, A-M-I-S. The results were dramatic improvement of performance from, it was able to glean the information from additional oceans of unlabeled data, and critically without, and consistently improving dramatically, not suffering. Whenever you have unlabeled data, you have to say, why isn't it just going to destroy the whole thing? How are you going to prevent that? And it does that. And that continues my interest, and it includes things like context. You could imagine, I think of a cohort of medical students. They all learned, let's say they all learned the same thing, and they're told this x-ray is this. They all go out to different places, they have different practices here, there, and we all, as human beings, value experience. In particular, in a neurosurgeon, rather, we go to an experienced person. But how we learn from experience is something of a mystery, and this model does, and it can do it individually. You could have all the same medical students with the same supervised knowledge going out in the world, learning in very different contexts, each one unique, and have confidence that, as we do as, say, patients, that learning from experience, hey, that's a really good thing. Okay, so I will, and that's one of my ongoing interests. So that was going to be your next question. Sorry.
Yes.
So we can wrap it up with your last
question. What you're working on now?
Long-winded. Yeah, that's my core interest right now. Yep.
Let's shift gears now. You were in at the beginning there at the 1987 meeting and the founding of the society. How was INS begun?
Okay. You'll probably get, if you ask 24 people, you'll probably get 24 different answers because we all had different experiences. So I was going to talk about something that maybe some people don't know about, because many of us experienced those wonderful early big meetings and the real thrill of those. But where INS began, even before those, was with the journal Neural Networks. And Steve founded it. He's still listed as sort of the founding editor emeritus. And he invited, in the early days, before the journal was anything, when it was just an idea, he invited Shinichi Amari to be the editor for Asia and Teuvo Kahonen to be the editor for Europe. Now, you can't have a journal without a publisher, and this was before everything was online, so everything was paper anyway. And there was a wonderful man named Bob Miranda, who was, I think he was the president of a smallish, by modern standards, smallish press called Pergamon Press. And he became one of our, he was almost like an uncle to the society. Now, this is a society that has no members. And he had really unwavering morale. He came to a number of our early board meetings for the society and publication support. He set up a price structure so that the society was in effect able to offer the journal as a benefit of membership at essentially no cost. There was a kickback to the society for each member that was pretty much the same as what it cost, what we had to pay. So at zero cost. And so I think it was the journal, Steve's vision of it, and also the publisher, Bob Miranda and Pergamon Press. Pergamon got gobbled up by bigger and bigger fish, and now it's Elsevier, but it's basically going back to the same origin, and the cover looked the same. I have a, here last year or so was an issue in honor of Steve's 80th birthday, and the cover, well, that's an unusual cover, but it's basically the same picture graphic, except for the picture on it. So that's how INS began. One of the ways it began.
Okay, that's a unique perspective. How about the future of INS? What do you think INS should do moving ahead into the future?
Okay, so of course that's in the hands of younger people and do what their vision is. But one of the things I hope the society will do that complements the role of other groups, especially IEEE, is to continue its core mission of supporting the integration of interdisciplinary brain and behavioral sciences with model development and application. And that was there from the beginning. And I think it is a real role. There are groups of various sizes that pay lip service to that, but are primarily, say, statistical or whatever, other things, engineering, useful things. But I think INS can have an integrative role that brings in the neural and cognitive and other sciences, as well as the engineering.
For a minute, I'd like to have you give free rein to your thoughts and your biases. What do you think people are doing right or doing wrong in AI now?
Okay, so I thought about that question and I thought, I don't know. But I wanted to answer a very, I think, importantly related question, which is, what is AI? Okay, so I'm going to talk about that for just a couple of minutes. What do we mean when we say artificial intelligence? And one thing I found interesting, this is a term that has been around throughout all these decades of my professional life. The phrase apparently was coined by John McCarthy in the 60s, I think. And he was primarily interested in enumerating rules for things like teaching a machine how to play chess, things like that. Now, when I went to MIT in the 70s, AI continued to be defined as this rule-based symbolic reasoning, which was realized as so-called expert systems. And this was the Minsky and Papert group and juggernaut money, whatever. And they built their reputation in the 70s by critiquing supposedly the Rosenblatt perceptron. In fact, Minsky and Papert published a book called The Perceptron, which claimed that they kind of set up, I believe, a straw man. If you really read what Rosenblatt had written, they take a little piece of it and then they trounce it and say, so neural models can't do anything. Neural networks are trash. But that was the 70s. And I found it interesting. And I've noticed this in with other phrases also. Every few years, at least every decade, it seems that the definition of artificial intelligence has morphed. So it started out, the anti-neural network, it's all about defining rules that can do things, and neural networks are just a figment. At some point, I don't know exactly when, maybe the 80s to the 90s, AI was the term coined to mean neural networks. It was very strange. When they were talking about it, all of a sudden it became neural networks. Okay, well, I guess they're not going to trounce it anymore. And interestingly, I had a conversation once with Shunichi Amari at a conference, and he is, of course, primarily in Japan. And at that time, fuzzy systems were all the rage in Japan, and you would even see ads for fuzzy rice cookers, and it didn't sound very good, but it was sort of the big fad. And what Shunichi told me was that actually, if you look at the technology they're implementing, they called it fuzzy, but those were neural networks too. I don't know. I guess they were, I don't know what neural networks, but that was what he told me. They actually were inside those fuzzy rice cookers. Even more weirdly, in my view, at some point, deep learning, so-called, arrived on the scene. I don't know if it was maybe 10 years ago, the phrase was introduced. And now that a lot of that is behind the wall of proprietary this and that. So I don't even know how it's morphed, but at least early on, as I understand it, and many of my colleagues do too, oddly, it was a Rosenblatt perceptron. And to call it AI, to call a Rosenblatt perceptron AI, I think of poor Rosenblatt, who of course died very prematurely and didn't live to see all these vindications of his initial wonderful vision from the 50s. And then also, even more generally, in the 2000s, Moneyball, which was the book by Michael Lewis and then the movie with Moneyball, where what quickly, it was obvious, it became obvious that statistical analysis was the way to go in what a field which is thriving now called sports analytics. That applies not only to teams, but even individual players. They hit with all the statistics they've got, and none of this sort of, oh, we got to get the biggest star and the one the fans want. You look at the data and you analyze it. But basically, most of that, at least early on, was statistics, and it was wonderful statistics. And it, well, I've seen in the last decade AI to become an umbrella term that covers everything in descriptions. If you look at, they call it AI, you look at who somebody's doing, and they're doing classical statistics. And then it includes adaptive systems and all of that. So if you take AI of all of quantitative analysis, I mean, how can I say I don't like it? I mean, of course, it's great, but this umbrella term, I don't know where it'll go. Maybe it'll break up into little pieces that are more descriptive, but AI really is such an enormous range of methods now, in my understanding of it, that who knows. So that's what I think about AI and what they should do with it in the future. The future belongs to them. More power to it. I think it's funny and great that so many people are talking about it. Know that everybody knows the phrase and all that stuff. Why not? It's good.
Finally, what advice would you give for a researcher just starting out in the field?
Okay, so you started out asking about women in the field, which of course I was one, and I don't have anything specifically to women, but advice to a young researcher is what I would tell young women as well as young men. So it's kind of a little bit of a personal. I just wrote down a few personal thoughts, and I think I could say this to people starting out in any direction in college or say. And it says, we each have just 24 hours in a day. And some of us are fortunate to be able to choose how we spend some of those hours, notably our research directions. At any given time, everyone seems to be working on the same small set of things. My advice, try to explore other corners of the universe. Seek something that grabs your imagination, something your mind refuses to let go of, a place where you think you may be able to make a contribution. But don't take this possibly lonesome route if you require ready praise and easy rewards. Praise and awards are very nice, but their pursuit can direct your time and attention away from what you really want from life, including all of life outside of work. Don't be afraid to give yourself to what matters most to you. Work, yes, and students, family and friends, children, and society. And if you're really lucky, you're going to have someone like me whose grandson is interrupting your interview with a request for a FaceTime, which I think is awesome. But try to accept the possibly painful fact that you might need to postpone or sacrifice professional recognition that you deserve. We each have 24 hours a day for as long as these precious days are ours. That's my advice.
Well, Gail, thank you very much. I very much
Thank you,
enjoyed it.
David. This was wonderful.